Today's episode of Off the Timeline is titled, What If Oregon Football Took Over the Big Ten Early? November 2019, Camp Randall Stadium, snow falling sideways, the crowd is screaming, and standing on the opposite sideline is Joe Burrow, not in LSU purple, not in the SEC, but wearing Nebraska red. The scoreboard reads Wisconsin 17, Nebraska 14. It's late third quarter, and America is watching what feels less like a football game and more like a battle over the future of the sport itself. Because in this alternate universe, the spread offense didn't invade the Big Ten, it forced the entire conference to choose a side. The sport was already changing, tempo offenses were spreading, quarterbacks were transferring, old school systems were starting to crack. But this was the season everything collided at once. This is the alternate history of the transfer that turned college football into a philosophical battle. And that sets the table for the quarterback who changed the argument. In the real world, Nebraska's rebuild under Scott Frost never truly worked. The expectations were enormous. The results never matched. But in this alternate timeline, Nebraska moves faster. Mike Riley is fired earlier. Frost arrives with more time to stabilize recruiting and install the offense before pressure completely engulfs the program. At the same time, at Ohio State, Joe Burrow realizes the starting job may never fully become his. Now you may be thinking to yourself that a Joe Burrow transfer alternate history sounds like familiar territory. And honestly it is. But this universe is fascinating because the transfer itself is only the beginning. Because instead of LSU, Burrow quietly visits Nebraska, and Frost sells him on something nobody else can. Not championships, not statistics, a mission. Frost tells him, everybody thinks this offense belongs on the West Coast. Let's prove it can survive Big Ten football. And Burrow commits. And suddenly, Nebraska becomes the most watched experiment in America. And that sets the table for Oregon seeing its reflection. At first, Oregon fans are fascinated. Nebraska suddenly looks familiar with tempo offense, spacing concepts, quarterback movement, speed in space, and aggressive play calling. It feels like Oregon football wearing snow boots. National media becomes obsessed. Fox pushes Nebraska heavily. Ratings spike. And something subtle starts happening across the conference. Programs begin asking themselves uncomfortable questions. If Nebraska can modernize this quickly, what happens if everyone else does too? Suddenly, Michigan experiments offensively faster, Ohio State speeds up even faster, and recruiting philosophy begins changing throughout the Midwest. And for the first time in years, SEC fans notice elite offensive recruits seriously considering staying north. Not because the Big Ten became tougher, because it became exciting. That changes the conversation. And that sets the table for Wisconsin refusing to bend. No program reacts more strongly than Wisconsin. Wisconsin sees Nebraska as everything wrong with modern football. Speed over physicality, branding over fundamentals, pace replacing control. While the conference begins modernizing, Wisconsin doubles down on its identity. Long drives, massive offensive lines, NFL-style linebackers, ball control, and their coaching staff openly questions whether tempo football can truly survive November in the Midwest. That's what makes this rivalry grow nationally, because suddenly Nebraska versus Wisconsin isn't just football, it becomes symbolic. One side believes football is evolving. The other believes the sport is losing itself. Talk radio goes crazy. Fans pick sides. Former players argue publicly. And buried inside all the noise, Joe Burrow keeps winning football games. And that sets the table for LSU becoming the missing equation. Meanwhile, at LSU, something feels incomplete. The talent is still overwhelming, the defense is still elite, the recruiting is still terrifying. But the offense never fully transforms into the machine we remember from real history. LSU remains excellent. That matters. They don't collapse, the sense that the pieces for something legendary existed but never fully aligned. And over time, SEC fans begin obsessing over Nebraska. Not because they fear Nebraska specifically, because they can't stop imagining what LSU could have become with Joe Burrow. And that sets the table for Clemson becoming the standard, because looming above everything is Clemson, the empire, the measuring stick. Every national conversation eventually returns to the same question. Yeah, but can this beat Clemson? Because Clemson represents stability, development, continuity, and even Dabo Swinney cautiously enters the national debate surrounding transfers and rapid offensive change. Not angrily, not theatrically, but carefully, because Clemson dynasty depends on long-term structure. Meanwhile, Nebraska represents acceleration, adaptation, chaos. And suddenly, college football feels divided into ideological camps, not just conferences, but philosophies. And that sets the stage and returns us to the game that defines the era. November 2019, Nebraska versus Wisconsin, snowstorm, top 10 matchup, massive ratings. The game immediately feels larger than football. Wisconsin dominates possessions early. Nebraska struggles physically. Announcers openly question whether spread tempo can truly survive this environment. And for a while, Wisconsin appears correct. But late in the third quarter, Nebraska adjusts. Quick throws, faster substitutions, short spacing concepts, tempo increases. Wisconsin's defense slowly begins tiring. And by the fourth quarter, the game changes completely and Nebraska wins 31-24. And the national reaction becomes enormous. Not because tempo football was new, because this was the moment it stopped feeling optional. That distinction matters. The spread offense already existed. Modern football already existed. But after this game, the idea that the Big Ten could permanently resist it suddenly felt impossible. And that sets the table for the playoff panic. The playoff rankings become chaos because now the committee faces multiple competing identities of football itself between Clemson, Nebraska, Oregon, LSU, Ohio State, and Wisconsin. Everyone has a legitimate case. TV executives quietly love it. Debates become nonstop. Should football reward modernization? Does strength of schedule still matter the same way? Can old school football survive this direction long term? And as ratings increase, playoff expansion discussions intensify far earlier and more aggressively than expected. Not because Nebraska invented change, because Nebraska accelerated the national argument all at once. And that sets the table for Oregon's strangest feeling. And something nobody expected happens. Oregon fans begin feeling displaced from their own movement. Because nationally, people start associating future football with Nebraska instead of Oregon. The student becomes more famous than the teacher. That tension gives the universe emotional weight. Because nobody fully owns what comes next. And that sets the table for the playoff. The committee selects Clemson, Ohio State, Nebraska, and Oregon. Oregon defeats Ohio State in a classic. Nebraska pushes Clemson to the edge, but Clemson wins 34-30. And after the game, Dabo delivers the quote that defines the era. Football changes fast, but eventually somebody still has to block and tackle. Traditional football survives, but barely, because by the following season, more teams increase tempo, transfer conversations intensify, offensive systems continue spreading, recruiting changes accelerate, and even Wisconsin quietly begins adapting. The sport was already changing, but this became the season everybody finally understood the direction it was heading. Years later, fans would still debate who actually won this era. Clemson won the championship. Nebraska became the symbol of change. Oregon lost ownership of its own identity. LSU became haunted by the quarterback who never arrived. And Wisconsin learned resisting evolution only works for so long. But the biggest change wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. Because in this alternate history, Joe Burrow didn't create modern football. He forced college football to confront what is becoming. And by the early 2020s, nearly every major program in America was running some version of the offense Wisconsin once insisted could never define the sport. And if you enjoy this alternate history and want more college football timelines where the entire sport spirals into chaos, hit like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next timeline.